The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets as Emma stood on the marble steps of the mansion she'd called home for 5 years, her mother, Catherine, shivering beside her in a thin cardigan. But neither woman knew that Catherine wasn't just the quiet, humble woman who'd raised Emma in a modest apartment. She was secretly the trillionaire owner of the very corporation that had made Emma's husband rich. David, Emma's husband of 5 years, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his expensive suit pristine against the warm light spilling from inside, but his eyes held nothing except cold contempt as he blocked their entry to the home Emma had decorated, the home where she'd cooked his meals and ironed his shirts and swallowed her pride 1,000 times. Behind David, his mistress Veronica draped herself across the leather sofa Emma had picked out for their 2nd anniversary, her laughter echoing through the foyer like shattered glass. But that laughter would soon turn to ash when the truth emerged. Emma clutched the single suitcase David had thrown at her feet, her wedding ring still on her finger, but feeling like a shackle now, her mother's frail hand gripping her arm as the wind howled around them. But neither could have predicted that this moment of ultimate humiliation would become the catalyst for David's complete and utter destruction. Catherine's lips trembled as she looked at the man who'd stolen her daughter's light, but she said nothing. Her secret buried so deep that even Emma had no idea her mother owned the company where David served as vice president, the company that had given him everything he had, the company that could take it all away with a single phone call. The snow began to cover their shoulders as David sneered and reached for the door, Veronica's mocking voice calling out something cruel about dead weight and finally free. But what neither of them understood was that the fragile old woman standing in the freezing night held more power in her pinky finger than David would accumulate in 10 lifetimes. Emma's heart shattered as the door slammed shut, the sound of the lock clicking into place like a gunshot in the winter silence. But something flickered in Catherine's eyes, then something ancient and fierce and absolutely merciless. Would Emma discover her mother's true identity before hypothermia set in? Or would Catherine reveal herself in a way that would make David wish he'd never been born? Would Veronica's laughter fade when she realized she had mocked the woman who could erase David's entire existence with a signature? Would David's cruelty on this frozen night become the biggest mistake of his miserable life? And would Emma find the strength to watch him fall? Or would mercy stay her hand when the moment of reckoning finally arrived? The beginning of the end started 6 hours before Emma found herself standing in the snow. But the seeds of destruction had been planted much earlier, 5 years earlier to be precise, on the day she'd met David Harrison at a charity gala. She'd only attended because her mother had insisted. Emma had been 23 then, fresh out of college with a degree in art history and dreams of opening her own gallery. But those dreams felt distant and foolish now as she thought back to that fateful night. David had been 28, sharp, suited and confident, working as a junior executive at Meridian Global Industries. But his ambition radiated off him like heat from asphalt in summer. "You look lost," he'd said, handing her a glass of champagne she hadn't asked for. But his smile had been warm then, genuine. Or at least she believed it was genuine. Emma had laughed, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her ear, but she'd felt the flutter of attraction even as warning bells whispered in the back of her mind. Just overwhelmed, she'd admitted, gesturing to the crowd of wealthy donors and corporate executives. But David had taken her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Let me un-overwhelm you," he'd said, leading her to a quieter corner. But what Emma hadn't known was that David had already done his research. He'd seen her arrive with Catherine, had noticed the way people greeted her mother with careful respect, had assumed Catherine had money hidden somewhere, despite her modest appearance. Catherine had been watching from across the room that night, her gray eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, but she'd said nothing when Emma introduced David an hour later, merely smiled and shook his hand with the grip of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. Catherine Monroe had started with a single patent 40 years ago, a revolutionary semiconductor design she'd created in her garage, but she'd parlayed that into Meridian Global Industries, a technology conglomerate worth $800 billion. No one knew Catherine owned the company, but that was exactly how she wanted it. She operated through layers of holding companies and trusts, her name appearing nowhere in public records, her face unknown to the shareholders and executives who worked beneath her invisible hand. The courtship had been whirlwind, but Emma had been young and naive and starving for affection. Her demanding, career-focused mother had never quite provided, or so she'd thought. David had proposed after 6 months, but the ring had been modest, something he'd saved for, and Emma had loved him more for the sacrifice she'd believed it represented. Catherine had offered to pay for the wedding, but Emma had refused, wanting to do it themselves, wanting to prove they could build something real without help. "Your mother doesn't like me," David had said one night during their engagement, his voice tight with resentment. But Emma had rushed to reassure him.